listen to the podcast or download the podcast. I just want to say something so it's not like information. It takes recently and puts them and basically says that some people where statistics show that students once they students of college African American if they're let's say in the grade, they should be as a full time in the second grade level consistently. So they try to jump achievement gap and they go into the schools and in the target areas that they're supposed to be in Chicago, Memphis, Tennessee, et cetera, et cetera. So if they get that, I'll do that for 2 years and then it's up.
Hello, my name is Rohini Ramnath, and I'm a member of the World Affairs Series Planning Committee and co-chair of the Committee on Lectures. Welcome. Before we introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to thank the Design College and the government of the student body for their funding. We also encourage you to attend the upcoming events. NASA Space Studies researcher Cynthia Rosenweig will speak about global warming and Iowa agriculture on Wednesday, February 28th at 7 p.m. in the Sunroom. Catherine Hales will speak about electronic literature this Thursday, March 1st at 8 p.m. in the Sunroom. Evelyn Hu DeHart will give an address on race and ethnicity on Friday, March 2nd at noon in the Sunroom. Emory Professor of Contemporary Middle Eastern History Ken Stein will speak about American foreign policy on Monday, March 5th at 8 p.m. in the Sunroom. Primatologist Jill Prutz on life in the savannah will speak on life in the savannah on Wednesday, March 7th at 8 p.m. in the Sunroom. We also have flyers and schedules at the door about these speakers and many others throughout the semesters. And now I'll introduce Jamie. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jamie Letourneau, and I'm a member of the World Affairs Series Planning Committee. And we are honored tonight to welcome Corey Wegener, a heroic and fascinating woman with a unique story. Corey is an assistant curator in decorative arts, architecture, design, craft, and sculpture at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and a retired major in the U.S. Army Reserve. Her last military assignment was in Baghdad, Iraq, as the Arts, Monuments, and Archives Officer for the 352nd Civil Affairs Command. Corey assisted staff at the Iraq National Museum after the looting that took place during the U.S. invasion and acted as military liaison to the Iraqi Ministry of the Culture. It is evident that Corey's passion for the protection of art and for the protection of people is immense, and we are eager to learn more about this tonight. Please join us in welcoming Corey Wegener.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for braving the elements and all the snow on the ground and the declining temperature to be here tonight. I really appreciate it. Well, I want to start out by saying that the symbol that you see here in front of you is the symbol, it's the blue shield. It's the symbol for, internationally, for the protection of cultural property during armed conflict. And it's a symbol that was laid out by the 1954 Hague Convention of the same name after World War II. And a lot of Americans, most Americans in fact, aren't familiar with this symbol because the United States and the UK are the only countries with any kind of significant military in the world that have not ratified this important convention. And the UK in 2004 announced that they will in fact ratify the Hague Convention and are working on the legislation to make that happen. So Keep that in mind throughout the presentation. I'm not necessarily saying that would have prevented the tragedy that happened at the Iraq National Museum, but as I think you'll agree, that it might have gone some way toward raising awareness, and I will talk a little bit more about the committee I founded, the U.S. Committee of the Blue Shield, at the end of the talk. So keep the symbol in mind. Also, I've given this lecture a number of times since I got home in 2004, or at least sort of variations. I do change it a little bit, and I hope improve it as time goes by. But I always start the same way, and that's by dedicating the lecture to the young woman that you see on the screen here, Nala Wahid. She was an interpreter for my team working in Baghdad for about 6 months, and everything that I learned was great about the Iraqi people. I learned from Nala, and she was a good friend. Unfortunately, she was killed in January 2004 by a roadside bomb while traveling in a convoy with my team to the Ministry of Culture building in Baghdad. So this is for Nala. So how does an art historian get to be in the Army and go to Baghdad to work at the Iraq National Museum? And better yet, how does the Army have positions that even worry about such things? And a lot of people aren't aware that that sort of position in the military started during World War II. There's a really great book out there, and if you're interested in such things, I recommend you read it. It's called The Rape of Europa by Lynn Nicholas, and it documents the Nazi looting of art history, basically from countries all over Europe, and not just from Jewish families, but from museums, from some of their own museums. And Hitler had this idea to build a fabulous museum in his home city of Linz that was going to rival Vienna because he had a grudge against Vienna. As you might know, he was an aspiring and really untalented artist as a young man. And so this was his goal, and much of the artwork that he stole, his goal was to put it into this museum in Linz. And he also had others working with him at looting art at a frantic pace. And the result was caches of art throughout Europe, and they hid it in salt mines and in palaces and all kinds of out-of-the-way places throughout Europe in order to try to preserve it until such time as they won, theoretically. But when that didn't happen, this artwork was stashed all around, and as the Allies started to come to Germany, they found it. And here you see some of the important generals of the Allies, Patton, Eisenhower, and they're looking over some of the paintings that they found. And during World War II, the realization that there was all this important art from Western art history throughout the battle zones of Europe, and that needed to be preserved in any way possible, they started to go around through the military and find people who had some sort of civilian expertise in art conservation, art history, archaeology, architecture, to see if they could preserve some of these works of art and historic spots, monuments, cathedrals, and they went around and mapped for the Allies and so that they wouldn't be bombed, and tried to keep the soldiers from billeting in them and destroying them in that manner. And then after the war, they were in charge of the repatriation of these artworks, and they were known as the Monuments Men. And I hate to keep pitching books, but there's a new, really fabulous book out that really focuses on the Monuments Men called Rescuing Da Vinci by Robert Edsel, and it just came out last year, and it has a really fabulous pictorial history of these really brave men and women who, there were only several dozen of them in the U.S. military, but also in the European militaries. And so that proud tradition has remained in the military, in the Army Reserves, in a branch called the Civil Affairs, and it comes down from sort of these monuments men. But that's not all we do, and in fact, we sort of lost track of how to do that, because since World War II, there really hasn't been a call for it. Although that specialization, it's now called Arts, Monuments, and Archives, has always been preserved in Army Civil Affairs and the Reserves, and that was the slot that I was in. When in 2003, as many of you saw on CNN, probably along with me, during the U.S. invasion of Iraq, we saw the Iraq National Museum being looted. Now, this young man doesn't have museum artifacts. I really haven't been able to get any photos of the museum actually being looted because good people with digital cameras weren't standing by watching. But he has a sink from one of Saddam's palaces on his back, and those really are gold-plated handles, etc. It's just kind of an iconic photo representing what was going on all around Baghdad and across the country in those days in early April. And I watched in disbelief during all this because I knew that civil affairs operators, had striven really hard to put together lists of areas in Iraq that needed to be protected. And I'd also read about archaeologists who had gone through that same thing. They went to the Department of Defense, noted all of these important archaeological sites, that the Archaeological Museum in Baghdad was one of the most important in the world, etc., and really thought that their voices had been heard, and I thought so too. So I wasn't terribly surprised around the end of April when I got a phone call from my assistant at the museum. I was on an assignment in Arizona for the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and I got a call from our curatorial assistant who said, "Corey, the Army's looking for you." And I said, "Well, I just bet they are." And I was scheduled to go to Afghanistan that summer, so I wasn't really sure how this would all come about. But when a 3-star general signs your orders sending you to Baghdad within the next 2 weeks, you get on the plane. And so here I am on the plane. This is a C-17 Air Force jet, and I'm sharing the ride with a bunch of Humvees. And here's just a day later, May 16th, I'm standing in front of the Iraq National Museum, and I have to say this was one of the last times that I was stupid enough to stand outdoors on the street without my helmet. And it was relatively safe feeling time then, though, to be honest. And there was just kind of a gradual degradation of the security situation over time. And as I said, I arrived on May 16th, 2003, and I left to go home on March 2nd of 2004. And as I noted at the beginning of the talk, our interpreter was killed. Another member of our team was shot by a sniper and sent home paralyzed. And so it was just this gradual feeling that things weren't right. And of course it all started, that feeling of things weren't right, with the looting of the museum. This is just to give you an idea of how the museum compound looked at the time. When I arrived, there was a fighting position dug in the front yard. And even though I mentioned we haven't actually ratified the 1954 Hague Convention, it is the military's stance that they do follow it as customary international law. And that's all kind of really complicated, but the bottom line is they knew there was some duty to protect cultural sites, but there was a feeling on one hand that the museum had lost its protection as a protected cultural site because enemy forces were using it as a fighting position, because there was a trench dug in the front yard. They were shooting from some of the storage magazines in the building. U.S. forces did return fire at them. There was a firefight, and the military commander on the ground at the time decided that the better part of valor, since the one thing that he did know is U.S. forces were not supposed to destroy that building, he made the decision to keep going. The trouble is, 3 days later, after the looting was really full in swing, they didn't come back, and that's the thing that I really fault. I wanted to mention this is the main gallery space that was open to the public in its heyday. However, the truth is that since the first Gulf War in the early 1990s, this museum had not been open to the public except for certain holidays like Saddam's birthday. So in some ways it's not surprising that once Good Law and Order broke down, many Iraqis felt like it was their due to raid this museum because they did not see this as their shared cultural heritage. They saw it as Saddam's personal property. They had never been allowed inside as part of a school group, etc. They just thought this was another thing of Saddam's to take in many cases. This is the other side of the compound. Think of it as a sort of horseshoe shape. And on the far right is the library, which was not looted, thankfully. They locked the stacks. That's in contrast to the Iraqi National Library, which was heavily looted and burned. And then the central section houses the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, which is in charge of all the archaeological sites, more than 10,000 recorded sites across the country, and all the more than a dozen regional museums throughout the country that are located near archaeological sites. And so What that should tell you is this is the flagship museum for the entire country. This is the National Archaeological Museum, and it truly is one of the most important museums on the planet. As you've heard time and again, I'm sure Iraq is Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers, the land of the first cities, the cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent. All those names apply because this truly is the birth of mankind. And you really can't toss a stone anywhere in the country without hitting a significant archaeological site. So that's why there was such a huge international outcry when this museum was looted, because that first thought was that all these really important objects that don't just document Iraqi cultural heritage, but all of our common cultural heritage. This is also, the heart of the home of Abraham, the father of all of Islam, of Christianity, and of Judaism. This is the place. So if you're a biblical archaeologist, that was huge. So here we are on a tour of the damage of the museum, and this was, you have to think, here I am coming from the nation's 10th largest encyclopedic art museum, where everything runs like clockwork, and everything is neatly in its place and dusted on a regular basis, etc. And here I'm taking another kind of tour that I'm not used to of damage and broken artifacts. And oh, by the way, that empty pedestal is where one of the most important sculptures in the history of the world was. So I was kind of in shock this whole time. And there was a team that was already on the ground doing an investigation of the looting called the Joint Interagency Cooperation Group, and that was headed by a Marine, Colonel Matthew Bogdanos. And he was in charge of finding out what happened to the objects and seeing if there was any evidence that the staff had been involved in, that sort of thing. I had a different mission. My mission was to ensure the continuing operation of the museum, to try to help them care for and preserve the objects that they still had in the collection, and to try to help them get up and running. I was so naive, thinking, oh, we'll be open in a couple of months. The museum has not opened to the public still to this day, many years later. So here we're on this tour, seeing where all the looters broke into the building. This gentleman is explaining how this is one of the back doors that you come into the motor pool. This is a relatively large building with more than 30 galleries to it. And they had a motor pool where a lot of the vehicles parked that were used to drive out to archaeological sites, little pickup trucks. All the pickup trucks were stolen, of course. But this gentleman's showing us how the looters were not able to get through this barred door. They found other easier access. But this is the first time I heard the term Alibabas used to refer to the looters, and I thought that was an interesting term because it comes from the tale of the 40 thieves, and they knew that we would understand that because it's an iconic story known the world over. This just kind of shows the generalized mayhem that was everywhere throughout the building, but I took pains not to photograph it very much because I was aware that everybody was watching me as this military person who strangely was also a museum curator. So I tried to explain to them, I'm a museum curator 99% of the time in my day job, just like you. We're colleagues, and I have this uniform on, a small part of the time, but I'm here to help you, and you have to try to believe that. And I had to earn that trust over a period of months. But so I tried not to act too shocked at things that I saw, and now I kind of regret not having the photos, but it was pretty much like this everywhere. Because the looters stole every single stick of furniture, just about. They overturned desks, they dumped out file cabinets in order to steal the file cabinets. They broke every single doorknob out of more than 200 doors throughout the building because the doors were all locked to the offices, so they just broke out the doorknob. So we had our work cut out for us to try to get that up and running into a place where people could come to work every day, let alone visitors could eventually come again. Here's the main lobby where the public would come into the museum when and if it was open. And you see the picture of Saddam up above the door. You can tell this is early days, only about a month after the U.S. invasion. That photo quickly disappeared. I was hoping I might be able to snag one of those at some point, but it wasn't meant to be, I guess. Down in the bottom corner of the photo, you see the museum's director, Dr. Nawala, the woman, and the head of the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage, so over all the museums in Iraq, her boss, Dr. Jabber, and they were relatively cooperative with us and good-natured about everything, but the problem with Dr. Jabber is we were soon to find out that his real last name was Al-Takriti, which means he's related to Saddam Hussein and is from the same village, so that was problematic. Eventually, he had a heart attack, which I'm not so sure he really did, but he resigned to go teach at the university again at about the time that the pressure was really on to find out how the museum had been looted. That's not to accuse him, I just think he couldn't stand the pressure of the Ba'ath Party people that were still around versus the coalition pressuring him to do things their way. I think it was easier for him to just be gone. This kind of shows the way the cases were throughout the building, broken or empty and unlocked, which is kind of curious. If you remember at the time, the news stories were everything's gone. Every object in the Iraq National Museum has been looted. All the cultural history of ancient Mesopotamia just gone. It was a tragedy on par with the burning of the Great Library at Alexandria, etc. Well, I came to find out that wasn't really true even before I got there. That the reality was they said 170,000 objects were missing, but the reality was there's more than 500,000 objects in this museum because every object that is excavated in the country of Iraq comes to this building to be cataloged before it goes on to a regional museum, or it will stay at this museum depending on the decision of the curators. In addition, during the lead up to the U.S. invasion, all the regional museums were scared because, little known fact, that about a dozen of those museums had been looted when Saddam lost his grip on power for a brief time during the first Gulf War. They lost more than 5,000 objects that were never recovered. So they knew full well what was likely to happen if good law and order broke down, and that was that Iraqis would turn on the museums and loot them. So they brought their collections to Baghdad for safekeeping. Bad idea in hindsight, but at the time they thought they were doing the best they could to protect the collection. So what ended up really happening, the real story, is that in the weeks and months leading up to the U.S. invasion, and there was a lot of signaling going on. I mean, anybody who watched TV could tell that this thing was probably going to happen. And the Iraqi senior administrative staff sent most of the workers home, and they made a pact to hide what was in the collection, what was in the galleries, in a secret hiding place, and they swore an oath on the Quran not to reveal that secret hiding place until the Americans were gone from Iraq. And so, in doing that, they saved their collection. They truly did that. They worked day and night and pulled things that were in those galleries into a secret storage location and hoped that there are 5 storage rooms or magazines, as they call them, in the Iraq National Museum, huge, vast storage areas underground mostly. And those were locked. Some of them were actually bricked over and plastered over so that you couldn't even tell there was a doorway there. And they hoped that that would save objects that were already in storage. And then, as we'll see later, they had some very important objects at the central bank vaults. So in doing all this, they did, and looking back on it, I would have done the same thing. If you told me that the Minneapolis Institute of Arts was going to be looted probably, or perhaps bombed by an invader, that's exactly what I would do too. I'd say, okay guys, let's figure out how we're going to save all this stuff. But the problem is that when the reporters came, they didn't know that. And they talked to one of the first people the reporters ran into after the looting was a woman who was in Newsweek magazine, tearing her hair and wailing and rolling on the ground, saying, it's all gone, it's all gone. And so when I arrived, I said, and it said she was the assistant director of the Iraq Museum. So I walked in with my Newsweek magazine that I dutifully bought at Fort Bragg before I left, and I said, I want to talk to this woman. And they said, oh, she doesn't work here, she lives down the block. She used to work here about 10 years ago. And so that was who, and translation is tough. I know that for a fact. And I'm sure the reporters didn't know who to talk to at that time. Most of the staff had not returned to the museum because of the security situation. And so, that was the story they got, and they were sticking to it. So she didn't know the plan either. She didn't know that things had been hidden, and the senior staffers weren't talking about it. And I was kind of mad when I found that out later, that in reality, about 15,000 objects had been looted of the 500,000 objects in the museum. That's not to minimize it. If the Mona Lisa were looted tomorrow, even if it was just one object, it would be a tragedy. You know, any kind of looting of cultural heritage is tragic. And some of the items were very important and some of them were really not important, but that's not to minimize anything. But they didn't come out with this story, and I was kind of perturbed by it at first, and then I realized, you know what, I wouldn't have either. What are you going to say? Oh, no, it's not really looted. Come on back and see if you can find it. So, that wouldn't have been too smart either. But we were taking a lot of heat from the world at large, and rightfully so. And it would have helped a lot if we could have said, oh, wait, it's not really all gone. Most of it was saved. Yes, ma'am.
I should be waiting until you finish.
That's okay, go ahead.
But have they found this, or has it been found?
Oh, I'm getting to that.
Oh, that's
You got about 20 minutes to wait. No, I'm just kidding.
That's fine.
So here we have all these galleries full of empty, unlocked, unbroken cases. If I were a reporter, I might ask why. That's because they weren't removed by force. They were removed by somebody with the keys. Now, some of the looters did have keys. There were probably 3 waves of looters. And the very first ones, it was probably an inside job. I mean, Interpol and the FBI art crime team and other law enforcement officials tell us in the museum field that 90%, and maybe more than that, of museum thefts are inside jobs. Somebody who has either used to work there, who works there now, who has an evil brother. My bad brother might come and break into the museum after going there with me and checking out the security system unbeknownst to me. But there's some connection with museum professionals, and that's probably the case here. I'm not saying that there was no proof that any of the current staff were involved, but whoever went in there knew where to find keys to the storage areas, knew where those bricked over doorways into the storage areas were to be found, broke them down with a sledgehammer, and made their way down into the storage areas. So many items were taken from the galleries that the staff that hid objects either couldn't move because they thought it was too heavy to move, for the looters even, was permanently installed, like these temple sculptures that apparently weren't so permanently installed as far as the looters were concerned. Or they were stuck to their bases, like this poor lion from Tel Harmal. They couldn't move him from his base, so they just vandalized him and smashed his head. Here's his mate intact. And as you can see, the staff made efforts to try to put foam rubber around sculptures and on the floors to protect in case there was aerial bombing. So, like I said, about 15,000 objects were looted from the museum at that time. But we had a no questions asked policy. If people brought things back, that they wouldn't be asked any questions. They could just walk away. So a lot of people brought things to the gates over time, etc. As of right now, approximately half of those 15,000 objects have been recovered. And about half of that half were recovered in Iraq at some point, whether it be at that no questions asked phase or at during raids and things like that. And about half of them have been recovered outside the country, which means that the black market in looted antiquities is alive and thriving, as we in the museum field know. Here's the Great Assyrian Gallery that has all these fabulous panels from the palace at Nimrud. And you can see that the Iraqis have sandbagged it to try to protect it in case the sculptures would fall during aerial bombing. This poor sculpture in the foreground was broken by the looters, though, because he was cemented to the marble base and they couldn't get it off, so they just broke it. This is Hatra, a Parthian settlement in Iraq around the Roman area, and they were bitter enemies of the Romans. So you can see that this sculpture resembles sort of the same Greek and Roman sculpture of that era. And the looters didn't take much of this. They just mostly broke it, and probably because of the nudity and the figure, human figure, depiction of the human figure is not accepted in Islam, and so that's probably why more of these weren't stolen, but they were certainly smashed. This is the Iran-Iraq War Memorial, And there was also a soldier's museum there, a sort of a tomb of the unknown soldier and a military museum there. And a lot of those things ended up being at risk, and we were able to pull, it was military uniforms, arms and armor, guns, swords, and that's kind of a area of the decorative arts, if you want to call it that I'm sort of interested in. And luckily it's one of those things that you can get soldiers interested in, but hopefully not too interested. So we were able to pack those up in a truck and bring them all to the Iraq Museum for safekeeping. There were a number of paintings recovered from the Museum of Modern Art that was located in the Iraqi Ministry of Culture. That was horribly looted, burned, flooded, all of the above during the looting. And unfortunately, a lot of them were down in the storage areas that flooded because when the looters would take all the plumbing, rip all the toilets off the walls, all the sinks off the walls, it would break the water mains, and then the basements of the buildings would flood. So we recovered a lot of those and tried to dry them out as best we could, and they're stored at the Iraq Museum as well. And I just remind you of going back to World War II. These are some of the monuments men that were rescuing works of art, and here they're admiring this painting down in this salt mine and preparing it to be restituted. So I guess it's kind of that beware of history, or if you don't study your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Beware of history. That's a good one, too. This is a project I didn't expect to work on that I didn't think I was going to be asked about. But before I left the United States, I read that they had recovered a number of Jewish texts from the basement of the Mukhabarat headquarters building. The Mukhabarat was the dreaded Iraqi secret police. And this is one of those kind of buildings where people disappeared. They'd come to get you in the middle of the night, you'd go in this building and no one would ever see you again. And after the war, this building was heavily damaged by coalition bombing, and rightfully so, legitimate military target. And some of Chalabi's group, the Iraqi National Congress, dove in the basement, which was also, bombing also floods the basements of buildings. And they were hoping to find a secret prison underneath the building and rescue people. They didn't find any secret prison or anybody alive in there, but they were coming up with scrolls and books written in Hebrew. And if you think back to your biblical history, Iraq, Babylon, the Babylonian captivity, this is where the Jews were brought by the Assyrians. And when they were allowed to go home later on, not all of them left. And Iraq was a huge center of Jewish population. In fact, up until the 1940s, Baghdad was 20% Jewish, up until the rise of the State of Israel, and then they started to be driven out, killed, etc. So most Jews had already left if they could afford to do so and could make it out. And by the time I arrived there were some Jewish aid organizations that I talked to there, because I also curate the Judaica collection at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts too, so it's an interest area of mine. And they told me there were less than 40 Jews left in the country, and they were there to get those out and take them to Israel. So this was pretty badly damaged, and I still look at these pictures and can't believe I walked around in there. It was kind of dumb. But this is where they found those texts, and they tried to dry them out as best they could. But when you get organic material like paper and scrolls, parchment wet in high temperatures, high humidity, it'll start to mold within about 48 to 72 hours. And so that's the problem they had. And I couldn't believe that they hadn't frozen the material, so I went to see it myself. And luckily I was able to get them to provide a freezer truck for us, because one of the people who got interested and involved in the project was the political advisor to Ambassador Bremer, and she could kind of make things appear as if by magic, and had lots of money to do so. So we hauled this stuff out, and that's the Kristen Silverberg, the advisor that I was just talking about. And we hauled everything out and put it into a freezer truck and took it back to the green zone and tried to keep it frozen as best we could. Here's one of the books that fared pretty well because it got dried out right away after they pulled it out of the water. But the other thing that Kristen could make appear out of thin air was expertise. I thought I was kind of all on my own, and when I advised that they freeze everything, they were kind of like, well, do you really know what you're talking about? You're just a curator, you're not a conservator. And I said, fair enough. Let's bring some conservators over, thinking, oh yeah, right, like they're going to do that. Well, not only did they brought me 2 conservators from the National Archives and Records Administration. So, and this is going back to World War II. These books are texts from Jewish synagogues around Europe that had been gathered for Hitler's horrific Museum of the Dead Race of the Jews that he was planning after the final solution had been executed. So again, I think bad people collect other people's books. So this is a teak, which is a Sephardic Jewish Torah scroll holder, and we were able to salvage that after we pumped all the water out. And these are some of my guys on my team. The incredulous Jordanian truck driver is in the background. He never quite understood what we crazy Americans were doing, and he stayed with his truck 24/7 though. Some of the storage areas at the museum, and these are Tekim, are dozens and dozens, hundreds literally, of those same types of Torah scroll holders, because these are in the museum's collection because they once had such a huge Jewish population in Baghdad, and most of the curators don't know anything about this material. It's kind of sad. There are the two conservators I was telling you about. Mary Lynn Ritzenthaler, the paper conservator in the middle, is most famous for having done the conservation work for the Declaration of Independence, so I knew I was in good hands. Here's one of the scrolls. That was about as far as we dared to unroll it. And again, World War II, and this young Jewish captain reading a Torah scroll in that same museum where they had everything stashed for the sort of horrible museum that Hitler was planning. So we convinced the Iraqi Ministry of Culture and Ambassador Bremer, which was the hard part, that this stuff needed to go somewhere else to be conserved because there just wasn't the equipment or the expertise in Baghdad. And we convinced them to send it to a commercial freeze-drying facility in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas. And I got to be the courier for the material. So we loaded it up in a little bitty airplane. This is a C-5A Galaxy Starlifter, which is the biggest aircraft that the Air Force has, which is, I used to joke, this is why the war costs $4 billion a month. It costs more than that now, even. And got to take it all the way to Dallas-Fort Worth. But one of the great, and I forgot to take pictures along this sort of 48-hour route, but the big fear was that the materials would thaw. And we managed to get a freezer container to put them in, but you couldn't run the container on the plane. So we made the decision to just not heat the cargo bay, which was fine as long as you were flying. But as soon as you landed, there was the danger that it would thaw. So the plan was not to land for very long and to just make our way to Texas as quickly as possible. Well, not to deride the Air Force too much, but the Army kind of jokes around that they're a lot like Northwest Airlines or anything else. When they've had enough crew time, they can't fly anymore and they have to rest and blah, blah. But infantry guys keep going as long as the mission requires. So we knew that something was going to go wrong, and so the Air Force guys in Baghdad gave me phone numbers at the Pentagon and all kinds of code words to use, and et cetera. It was all very exciting. And so we landed unexpectedly in Rota, Spain, because they needed crew rest. And so I was told, if this happens, get off the plane and say, I want to talk to the commander of the flight line. So I dutifully did that. And they sent me because I was military and I was a major, and which is not super high, but it's also not the low either. So hopefully I would outrank whoever was making decisions. And he came into the office while I was on the phone to the Pentagon, who assured me not to worry, that they would, put the pressure on to get me another flight crew as soon as possible. And you don't talk about what you're couriering. Even in the art world, I courier for museums, loan exhibitions and things like that. And you never tell the drivers what you have in the box and that kind of thing, and it's just an understanding. But apparently this Navy lieutenant had not heard that. And he came in and he said, what do you got in that box anyway, ma'am? Human hearts or something? And I was just about to chew him out because I'd looked at his collar and I outranked him. And I said, no. And I looked up a little further and I noticed he was wearing a yarmulke, which is a traditional Jewish man's head covering, which you almost never see in the military these days. It's allowed to wear, but you just don't see it. And I swallowed my really bad retort, and I didn't chew him out. And I said, no, Lieutenant, what I have in the box is what's left of the cultural heritage of the Jewish people of Iraq, and I really need your help. And he barely skipped a beat, and he said, tell me what to do. And I said, I need a generator, a Spanish generator that can talk to electrical setup that can talk to this Kuwaiti generator and get it frozen long enough to get a new flight crew. And then you can get me a flight crew. So he took care of it all. But before I left, he made me talk to his rabbi on his cell phone. She said, "You'll never believe me. You have to explain this." So that was kind of fun. But so here we are in Dallas-Fort Worth unloading. And we made it to this commercial freeze-drying facility where they can freeze-dry things by the train car load. And it's designed for businesses and libraries and disasters like Hurricane Katrina. But our little 27 trunkloads of objects went in there, and then I dutifully got back on the plane and went back to Iraq. Oh, my head got cut off. But I sent this picture back to my colleagues to say that, don't worry, I can find a job anywhere. And I'm now working at the Ice Pepsi Cold Museum chicken stand. I put this in here because we had a discussion over dinner about the Palace of the Four Heads. And this is, when you hear about the Green Zone and the Palace or the U.S. Embassy or, before 2004, CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, this is the headquarters. This is the building where it all happens. And these are the sculptures of Saddam that were up on top, and there were 4 of them. It's a huge building. It's hard to photograph because you can't really it's so big that you can't get a good view of it from across the street. And so I was actually up standing by one of the other 4 heads when I took this picture. And these are bronze. They're huge. They're taller than from the floor to ceiling in here. And then this is the sort of interior of the palace. I get asked this a lot, so I thought it would be nice to put this in here to show people this is where people are working. It looks really fancy schmancy, but when you get up to it, it's really, really tired and it's not great workmanship. Saddam never actually lived in this palace. And then finally, I mentioned to you earlier that some of the collection was kept in bank vaults to keep it safe. And the goal here was to find out, there's a famous collection called the Treasure of Nimrud, and it's from the same palace as those sculptures I mentioned to you earlier from the palace at Nimrud, which is circa around 900 BC. And it's a fabulous collection of gold jewelry that was owned by some of the queens of the Assyrian Empire, and these ladies liked their jewelry, let me tell you. And they were actually, it's an interesting story because they were actually discovered by Iraqi archaeologists for a change. The British didn't beat them to it. And it wasn't until the late 1980s that it was actually excavated, even though Nimrud had been excavated in the mid-19th century. And so archaeological history is one of my new favorite hobbies, even though I knew nothing about it before I went to Iraq, so sorry. At any rate, so we were here to make sure that the treasure, which had not been seen in many years because the museum wasn't open, there was no reason to pull it out of the bank vaults, but there had been a rumor going around that Uday and Qusay had gone to the central bank, Saddam's 2 sons, before the war and taken a withdrawal of millions of dollars, US dollars in cash. And there was some real fear that they might have known the location of the treasure of Nimrud and other really important gold artifacts from the museum and taken them as well. The bank was damaged during the coalition bombing and flooded. Seemed like every place I went was flooded, and I had to buy new boots like every month. And so here we are. It's about 5 floors below ground, though, and so it wasn't heavily damaged. But think that it's 120 degrees at least, even 5 floors down. There's still water on the floor. It's dripping with mold everywhere. It was just a nasty place to be. And we waited about half an hour right there where you see it for the guy with the keys. We were forever waiting for the guy with the keys. And so I like this picture from World War II of a civil affairs soldier trying to open a Nazi safe. Here we are moving some of the objects into a dry